If we speak about austerity, one thing we have to know is what it is not about. And this is so important because if you do read the newspapers, and I encourage everybody to spend most of their time reading the business newspapers, because that is where important issues are being discussed, meaning issues that pertain to your private lives and working lives. And when they talk about austerity, they say it is about paying off public debt. It is not about paying off public debt. If they talk about austerity, they say it's about rolling back the state. It is not about rolling back the state. If they talk about austerity, they say it is about creating a level playing field on the world market where everybody can compete on an equal level and succeed if he or she only tries hard enough. It's not about creating a level field. What austerity really is about, at least that's my point of view, is using state power. The state is here to stay, using state power to redistribute wealth within countries from poor to rich, and also across countries, and again from poor to rich. And this happens globally, as is probably widely acknowledged that there's very poor countries and a few pretty rich countries, and in all of these rich countries, of course, you also find lots of poor people. And this redistribution also happens within Europe, and this is what I'm going to talk about, obviously, tonight. That's our topic. But I will not start with Greece. I will start with post-Second World War Germany, and you will see why in a moment. After the Second World War, Germany was economically destroyed, politically, well, let's say, in shambles, but it got a second chance. It got a chance to compete successfully in the world market, largely shaped by the United States of America. And the United States of America, with their allies, gave Germany this chance. They forgave lots of debt that the Germans had accumulated over the Second World War. They also forgave a lot of other things. And they gave Germany a very favorable exchange rate. Now, and on top of that, labor was at that point not dirt cheap, but pretty cheap, and that was left over happily maintained after the fall of the Nazi regime, which was cheap wages, low wages. So low wages, favorable exchange rate, no debt. While it's not so difficult to compete on those three counts, and the Germans did, and they became a major world exporter. On the other side of the globe, you would see something similar in Japan. The Americans were very good picking allies, former enemies in the war, who would then serve as bastions in the struggle against communism. So from the West and the East, you see kind of there was this containment strategy of the Soviet Union, which was a welcome pretext for the Americans to establish their empire and make new friends, like with the Germans, who were so grateful that everything was forgiven to them, and they could start flooding the world market with their Volkswagens and BMWs rather with their tanks, which hadn't been such a resounding success in the past. The trouble with that success of selling all these Volkswagens and BMWs is that one of the countries that imported lots of that stuff, the United States of America I'm talking, ended up in a current account deficit, meaning they lived, in economics language, they lived beyond their means. They started not only importing these nice cars and other things, they also had to start importing capital to pay for these things, meaning they started accumulating debt. Now, at some point, the Americans thought they had enough of that, not of the importing, but the magnitude of that, in particular the debt accumulation, and pulled the plug on the favorable exchange rate that the Germans were given, and other countries too. After Second World War, there were fixed exchange rates across the Western world, and that ended in 1973. And the trouble for export stars like Germany, but also Japan, was that their currencies would rise in value, meaning their Volkswagens or Toyotas would become relatively more expensive in the United States of America, meaning there was competitive pressure. On top of that, within the United States, there were some adjustments under the pressure from all the incoming Volkswagens and Toyotas. Americans figured, well, we have to do something, and that something is we relocate production, and not to China, as many people believe, even though Nixon had already been to China and shook hands with Chairman Mao. The relocation was largely within the United States, from the Union states around the Great Lakes areas to the south, where you had Dixie but no unions, meaning you had cheap labor. So there was a bit of a rebouncing of American manufacturing, or at least it looked like there could be, and Germany had to figure out ways how to adjust to these pressures. The Americans finding sources of cheap labor and the Deutschmark rising in value. Now, what could be done? Of course, you can go the American way and you find sources of cheap labor. And so the Germans did, and some smaller countries allied to them, Austria and the Netherlands, for example, forming a mercantile economic bloc. They looked south, just like the American industrialist manufacturers had done. And what they saw was post-military and fascist dictatorships, Mediterranean countries. You see Mediterranean countries joining the European Common Market, which is now known as the European Union. Greece was the first, actually, joining the European Common Market in '81. Spain and Portugal followed in 1986. And they could have become kind of the Dixie countries of Germany if something unexpected would not have happened. And that unexpected was the collapse of the Soviet Union and its allied or satellite, depending on how you see this, countries in Eastern Europe. Because what happened with that was that labor in Southern Europe would have been cheaper than it would have been than it was in Germany. But even cheaper was the Eastern European labor, and it was also highly educated. That was a heritage from state socialism in those countries. So very quickly manufacturers figured, well, we are not moving parts of our production to the south, we go east and we colonize those territories. And this, of course, left the southern periphery of Europe in a bit of a bind, and they didn't know exactly what to do. Well, they found, or they were assigned, a new role, and this is where European Monetary Union comes in quite handy, because what European Monetary Union meant was that interest rates in southern European countries declined to German levels. And for that reason, it became quite attractive and cheap to invest into Southern Europe. There was an influx of money from north to south within Europe, and that created a bubble. So Southern Europe started something similar like the Anglo world. Britain, Ireland, and the United States of America. They imported lots of money, and they enjoyed that money, they spent that money. Today they are called lazy for doing that and wasteful, but of course German manufacturers were very grateful for this wastefulness, because that's how they could continue selling their Volkswagens and BMWs, hoping that nobody would ever buy a Toyota. Now, as you may have heard, Canada didn't see much of it, but not far away from here, south of the border, people notice that bubbles tend to burst, and then the buck stops, at least it stops for a while, and the people who got some credit, even though nobody ever really expected them being able to pay it back, well, they will be cut off credit, but the people who gave the credit, the creditors, of course, they get a bailout. And the bailout in Europe happened in similar ways it happened in the United States of America. Again, it goes from the poor to the rich. And the beauty of the European bailout was what really happened was that German and also some other, actually French banks were pretty big invested in Greece. I'm leaving out now Spain and Portugal, focusing just on Greece. So these banks in the European center were bailed out, but it wasn't sold like that. It was sold as, well, the lazy Greeks blew all the money and now they have to pay the price, which is actually very similar to what happened in the US in the sense that you had all these poor working class households whose wages were insufficient, who were talked into buying houses they really couldn't afford, but they were talked in buying them anyways. And when it turned out that they really couldn't afford them, well, then they were evicted. And equivalent to the evictions of poor working class households in the United States, you got the Troika marching into Athens and telling Greek people to tighten their belts. Of course, not all Greek people, only those who were still living and trying to make a living in Greece. Smart Greeks, of course, were living there because it's beautiful, as I hear from my Greek comrades. But they were smart in the sense that their money was already somewhere else. But as a socialist, I must say, it didn't help us at all that we were so smart saying how awful things will be. And I think this is the great challenge, that understanding how we do get into this mess is one thing, and telling people this is how it will be is one thing. But it's probably not the biggest thing in building movements that are able to stop this thing. And I will stop here because I do not have very much to say on this, but I'm looking forward to learn about it from my Greek comrades. Thank you very much.
One of the things to keep in mind, whether we're talking about Greece or Canada or Nicaragua or whatever, is that what happens in particular countries isn't just the result of what those countries do. We have a global system. And I want to speak in some particular ways about how the global system has affected Greece. Now, to begin with, Greece won its independence in a revolt from the Ottoman Empire back in the 1820s. When we did get our independence, the great powers at the time, which were Britain, France, and Russia, essentially established a form of colonialism. They did not want, they didn't appreciate the idea of little countries having independence. So they decided that they would force Greece to have a king, not a Greek king, but actually a 17-year-old prince from Bavaria was made the king of Greece. He didn't speak Greek, and he was given essentially dictatorial powers, as you would expect from a monarch, all to keep Greece in its place to do the bidding of these larger powers. The main resistance to fascism in Greece in the Second World War was left-wing, and they had popular support, but they were not allowed to come into power in a democratic means. In fact, the British imposed a government beginning in 1944, which kicked off a civil war, lasted about 5 years, and in which hundreds of thousands of people were victims. When the Brits could not continue in 1947 because their empire was starting to fall apart, the new empire, the United States, took over. This was when Harry Truman announced the so-called Truman Doctrine, saying that the U.S. would fight communism everywhere and so on. And the U.S. began the financing and military support for the right-wing Greek government, which by 1949 had conquered. So Greece has always been seen in the modern era as essentially a puppet or potential puppet of one empire or another. When we're looking at Greece in the present crisis, however, I want to go back a little bit in terms of what led up to it. And one of the biggest problems, and you see this all the time, you saw this as Ingo was saying in regards to poor people in the U.S. who bought homes that they eventually lost, was every time there's a crisis in capitalism, the elites, the media and so on, blamed the people. it's these poor, it's these lazy people, and so on. And while the situation in Greece has obviously had a lot of complex sources, what I'm arguing is the Greek people themselves are not responsible for the crisis or for the debt. Again, it must be seen in this global perspective. Now, obviously, again, as Ingo was pointing out, the Greek elites, the political and economic elites, the multimillionaires and the billionaires, working with the economic elites in Europe and eventually the European Union, of course, they were essentially feathering their own nests at the expense of the future economic stability and prosperity of Greece. One of the biggest problems, and keep coming back to this, is when Greece adopted the euro, while there were some benefits, essentially it meant it lost control of its economy. Okay, it was, and I'll mention some examples in a minute, but in other words, it became more of a puppet of international players. Greg Palast, who's an author some of you may have read, said, slightly exaggerating, he said, quote, "The euro is simply the Deutschmark with little stars on it." He went on to say that he wrote this about a month ago, "Greece cannot adopt Germany's currency without adopting Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, as its own. And Schäuble has determined that Greece must be punished." And this is another thing, and again, partly goes back to having a larger perspective. On the one hand, as Ingo pointed out, what the elites do fear is not just Greece, but Greeks, Italians, the French, the Spanish, like Podemos, which is the rising party in Spain now, and even in other European countries, coming together, realizing that they have common problems and possibly common solutions. Because Greece is only about 2 or 3% of the European economy. They could fix the problem. The Troika could fix it without any economic issues at all. But they don't want to set an example, a bad example from their point of view. But essentially, you've got foreign investors, as Ingo was saying, French banks, German banks, individuals who are saying, the Greek economy is not doing well, so their bonds are paying a high interest rate because the risk is high. So we will take a chance. We'll buy these bonds to make a lot of money. But they know that if there's an economic problem, if there's a downturn, they know that the Greek people will be forced to pay back their bad investments, because for every bad borrower, there's a bad lender, essentially. Now, sometimes in this case, it's called austerity. For decades, in regards to the same policies being imposed in Latin America, in Asia and Africa, it was called structural adjustment. And in both cases, the International Monetary Fund had a huge role there. So Chomsky uses a term actually they got from the US government, referring to this as odious debt. When there's a debt that's imposed upon a people that they haven't in any democratic way arranged for, that they don't benefit from, and yet they're supposed to pay off the investors who were planning to make money off of the high interest rates on the bonds or whatever. And again, this term comes from the US 100 years ago. And the US even said, people are not obliged to repay an odious debt. Well, I'm arguing that's what happened to Greece. Again, that's what happened in Mexico. This is what happened in South Korea. So many other examples. Mexico, where when the investors are running into trouble, they use the IMF or the United States government or whatever to pressure local governments to squeeze the people, to pay back the rich speculators, which of course increases more inequality, poverty, and so on. So it was called structural adjustment when it was applied to the so-called third world. Now it's austerity in Greece. And again, these are global issues, but always ask yourself who benefits. And it's not the people of these countries, It's obviously the various national and international elites. In addition, The Guardian reported a couple of years ago that the International Monetary Fund admitted that they made a huge mistake when they imposed austerity on Greece. And Paul Krugman, some of you know, is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. He writes for the New York Times. He's not a Marxist, that's his problem, but he's a smart guy. And what he says, and again, I can quote here from other sort of mainstream economists and so on, but that if you want to revive an economy like in Greece, the last thing you do is destroy trade unions, cut back on things like a social security net, on health care and so on. What you do is basic Keynesianism, like the US and Canada did in the Second World War, and even, and these policies, again, they're not that radical. Obama has come out in favor of this kind of policy. Mark Carney, who used to be the governor of the Bank of Canada and did so well that he's now the governor of the Bank of England, said that, quote, the Eurozone needs to ease its hardline budgetary policies and make rapid progress towards a fiscal union that would transfer resources from rich to poor countries. Quote, since the financial crisis, all major advanced economies have been in a debt trap where low growth deepens the burden of debt. In other words, what the EU needs to do, and I would argue that we should do here, but it's not going to happen as long as the Harpatron's in charge, we need to put money into people, into creating jobs. You know, it's obvious, green jobs, put money into healthcare and so on, rev up the economy. Again, it turned things around in the Second World War, but the opposite policy is being pursued now in Greece. What you have is a situation, just to wrap up, where we finally have a government in Greece which just says, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to put up with this anymore. It's not fair. It's not right. And the latest polls I've seen say 2/3 or more of the Greek people support what Syriza is doing. But again, you've got the elites led by Merkel and the other, some of the other foreign ministers and prime ministers and so on, saying that, no, we can't let Greece be an example. And I'll just close by talking about when the United States conducted its terrorist war against Nicaragua in the 1980s. Oxfam explained that Nicaragua, which brought in land reform, rights for women, rights for Aboriginal people, free healthcare, free education, was the threat of a good example. Because what if other countries said, our government should work for our people as opposed to foreign elites and multinationals? And I would argue the same threat is seen in Syriza. If they actually win around for the Greek people, other people in the Mediterranean, in Ireland, and around the world will say, look, it works. And the last thing elites want is the people of the world to unite. On that cheerful note, thank you very much.
The European Council, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, who each are overseeing the restructuring of the Greek economy for the reason that it couldn't sustain, the Greek government couldn't sustain the public debt that it had accumulated the years prior to 2010. The debt in 2010 was at 130% of the GDP. It's a big number, but it's not a huge number if you look at different countries around the world and the debt that they had. So meanwhile, after 2010, Greece received one of the largest bailout packages any country has received. It was about 230 billion euros over 5 years. That was 2.5 times the actual economy, the bailout package. So it's very hard to understand how such a big bailout package didn't eventually pay off that debt. So meanwhile, though, Troika obviously gave this bailout package to Greece, but required something in return, and that was to sign 2 memoranda of reforms, one in 2010 and the other in 2012, that essentially created the basis of the austerity program, the austerity measures in Greece. And that austerity program that was described earlier as well led to a recession of the Greek economy. Actually, the Greek economy contracted by about 25%, which is the fastest and the largest amount an economy contracted over peacetime anywhere in the world any time in history. The incomes and the wages were reduced by about 1/3, and that happened mostly in urban families, in urban families with kids. Okay, is that better? and that created a huge problem because this is one of the most vulnerable part of the population because they have dependents and they don't have any other means to withstand the pressure, the economic pressures. They cannot cultivate the land because they live in urban areas. They cannot find any other means of earning income. So the unemployment, as we heard before, skyrocketed to 25% overall, and 1 out of 2 young people is right now unemployed. But not only that, there were the people who were employed were actually found themselves in very precarious conditions with flexible employment schemes and part-time jobs and so forth. So there was a misleading narrative, therefore, that we are doing all this because we want to save Greece, we are giving Greece all this money, but actually, if you look at the numbers, only 11% of the money, the bailout packages that were provided to Greece, were going to pay off, to sustain the Greek state, to pay off salaries and so forth. The rest was going in to actually service the debt, is going back into the hands of the creditors, and it was going, and 16% was going into interest rates alone. So we are seeing that there was a narrative, the victimization that you spoke about before, Peter. It was excellent and it worked. The people, you blame the victims for the economic situation. You blame the victims for the debt, and so that you can convince them to accept the terms of the austerity, because they feel guilty that this situation, they created the situation which they are actually not responsible for. And that is a recipe that has been used everywhere in history whenever we want to contain people, whenever we want to contain movements, popular movements. Syriza has a very big struggle to face. And the struggle and the big dilemma is the following. On the one hand, Syriza has to service and is committed to servicing the interest of the people that elected him. But on the other hand, it cannot lose the social majority that has given rise to it. And the social majority, the 32% of the people, which now has increased, seeing the effort that Syriza is putting into this struggle, this social majority is still hesitant in leaving the European Union, in leaving Euro. And the question is, what should Syriza do right now? Leave the European Union and lose the support that it has from the majority of the Greek people, or stay within the European Union and fight a struggle against the regime, waiting meanwhile for the Podemos in Spain to rise and for other working class alliances throughout Europe to emerge. Truly, the alternative that we have is for us to take control. Syriza is is an expression of the government, is an expression of the will of the people in the government. So unless the people themselves recognize and form these coalitions that will help Syriza make the radical steps forward and away from this crisis, Syriza cannot do it by itself.